I have always believed that good work speaks for itself. Numbers, results, satisfied clients. Those are the real endorsements of a professional's worth. That's why I never spent too much time polishing my LinkedIn profile or chasing praise in the office. My name is Jonathan Blake, and I was the Senior Account Director at Stanton & Blake, a mid-sized marketing agency in Chicago. My specialty? High-value corporate accounts. Over the years, I'd built a portfolio of clients whose combined annual spend exceeded $12 million. I negotiated contracts, built campaigns that became industry case studies, and, frankly, kept this agency in business more than once. I didn't just bring in clients, I kept them loyal. And yet, despite my track record, I always sensed something lurking beneath the surface, a quiet tension between me and Mark Stanton, the CEO. Mark was the type of man who loved being the smartest person in the room. He liked to remind people that he, quote, built this company from nothing, often conveniently forgetting the employees who had turned his ideas into revenue. I kept my head down and delivered results, but I noticed the way his eyes lingered on me when I spoke in meetings, calculating as if wondering whether I was a threat. Still, I ignored it. My wife Rachel was 8 months pregnant, and my focus was on building a future for our growing family. We'd spent years saving for our first home in Evanston, and with the baby just weeks away, I wanted nothing more than stability. My career was at its peak. My clients trusted me completely, and I genuinely thought I was indispensable. But life has a cruel way of proving that no one is untouchable. The first sign came during a Monday leadership meeting. Mark avoided eye contact with me. The usual banter felt forced. Later that day, I received a calendar invite from HR for a, quote, performance review. That was strange. My annual review wasn't due for another 5 months. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was probably routine. It wasn't. That meeting would change everything. When I walked into the HR conference room the next morning, the mood told me everything before a single word was spoken. The blinds were drawn. The air felt heavy. Samantha, our HR director, sat stiffly at the table with a folder in front of her, avoiding my gaze. And then there was Mark Stanton, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, that smug half-smile on his face that I'd come to despise. "Jonathan," Mark started, his tone oozing false sympathy. "Thank you for joining us on such short notice. Let's get straight to it." I sat down, heart pounding. "Straight to what?" Mark glanced at Samantha before speaking. "After careful consideration, the leadership team has decided to move in a different direction. As of today, your position with Stanton and Blake has been terminated." The words hit me like a gut punch. I actually laughed out of disbelief. "Terminated? What are you talking about?" "I just closed the Edgewell Industries deal 2 weeks ago. Our biggest contract this quarter. My clients—" "This isn't about your clients," Mark interrupted, his voice clipped. "It's about alignment. We need leaders who share the company's vision for the future. And, frankly, Jonathan, you've been resistant to certain changes we're trying to make." "Resistant?" I had challenged some of Mark's more reckless ideas in meetings, sure. Ideas that would have gutted client budgets for short-term gain. Apparently, integrity was now called resistance. I stared at him, trying to process. "You're firing me. A week before my wife gives birth? Are you serious?" Samantha shifted uncomfortably. Mark, on the other hand, didn't flinch. "I know the timing isn't ideal, but business decisions rarely are. Business decisions." He said it like I was a spreadsheet cell being deleted. My hands clenched under the table. "This makes no sense. My portfolio brings in $12 million a year. Who's going to handle those accounts?" Mark's smirk deepened. "We'll take care of the clients. You don't need to worry about that anymore." And then it clicked. This wasn't just about me. He wanted my clients. He wanted to cut me out, take my accounts, and make sure the commissions and credit stayed in his pocket. "This isn't about alignment," I said, my voice low. "This is about control. You want what I've built." Mark leaned forward. "Jonathan, it's not personal. It's business. You'll receive a standard severance package, and I'm sure a man with your skill set will land on his feet." I wanted to reach across the table and wipe that smug look off his face. But instead, I stood up. My body trembled, but my voice stayed steady. "You're right. I will land on my feet. And when I do, you'll regret this." Mark chuckled like I'd just told a joke. "Good luck." I walked out of that room in a daze, My severance papers clutched like a death certificate. By the time I reached the parking lot, the anger set in, hot, all-consuming. How could he do this? After everything I'd done for that company? But then I thought of Rachel. I thought of our unborn daughter. And suddenly, the anger wasn't enough to drown out the fear. How was I supposed to tell her? That night, I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the floor as Rachel rubbed her swollen belly. "You're quiet," she said softly. I didn't know how to say it. "Rachel, they fired me." Her hand froze. "What? But why?" "Jonathan, you're their top account director." "I don't know," I lied, because the truth, that I'd been discarded so my boss could steal my work, felt too bitter to voice. "They said they're moving in a different direction." She didn't speak for a moment. Then she whispered, "The baby is due in 2 weeks." "I know," I said, my voice breaking. "I know." She reached for my hand. "We'll figure it out." But I wasn't sure I believed that. Not yet. For the next few days, I wandered through a fog of humiliation and panic. My phone buzzed with emails from clients. Confused about why I wasn't answering, HR had sent out a cold, 2-sentence memo announcing my departure. Mark hadn't even bothered to call them himself. That was the final insult. These clients weren't just accounts. They were relationships I'd nurtured for years. And now they were being stolen. Just like my dignity. On the third night, unable to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table staring at my laptop. I pulled up the client lists, the projects I'd built, the years of value I'd created. And that's when something shifted. Mark thought he'd broken me. But in that quiet, sleepless moment, I realized he'd made a mistake. He underestimated me. And that was going to cost him everything. 3 days after being fired, I stopped thinking like a victim. It didn't happen suddenly, like in some motivational speech. It was a slow burn, the humiliation hardening into something sharper, more dangerous. Rage gave way to clarity. I'd spent nearly a decade building Stanton and Blake's client base. Those weren't Mark Stanton's relationships. They were mine. I knew every client's pain points, their budget cycles, their risk tolerances. I knew what they complained about behind closed doors and what they needed but never got. And if Mark thought he could swoop in and take credit for my work without consequences, he didn't know me at all. I opened a blank document on my laptop and started listing every client I had managed. 23 names. I added notes, their industries, key contacts, renewal dates, the campaigns in progress. As I typed, I realized something staggering. Within the next 6 months, nearly 60% of those contracts were up for renewal. That was my window. Of course, I couldn't just call them and say, "Hey, I got fired, come with me." That would violate non-solicitation clauses in my contract. But I also knew the law. I called a friend, David Lamb, a corporate attorney I'd met through one of my clients. Over coffee at a small cafe, I slid the severance paperwork across the table. "Tell me what I can and can't do," I said. David scanned the documents. "They've got a standard non-compete for 12 months, but it's broad and, frankly, weak. Illinois courts don't like overreaching non-competes, especially when they're this vague. As long as you don't actively poach their clients or use proprietary data, you're fine." I leaned forward. "So if clients come to me," he shrugged. "That's different. You're not soliciting. You're being approached. Just don't be reckless about it." That was all I needed to hear. On the drive home, my plan began to crystallize. I wasn't going to wallow or beg Mark for scraps. I was going to build my own agency, leaner, smarter, client-focused. And I wasn't just going to compete. I was going to win. The first step was funding. I didn't have deep pockets, but I had a $50,000 severance package and about $30,000 in savings. It wasn't much, but I didn't need much. My value wasn't in a fancy office or a dozen employees. It was, in my mind, in the strategy, creativity, and trust that my clients had in me. I named the agency Blake Strategies. It felt personal, intentional. I wasn't hiding behind a corporate facade anymore. The next step was infrastructure. I converted the small den in our house into an office, bought a reliable laptop, set up project management tools, and hired a freelance designer and copywriter on a per-project basis. I didn't need a full team yet. I needed flexibility and speed. Then came the hard part, Rebuilding my professional image. I started posting on LinkedIn, not desperation posts, but thoughtful industry insights, sharing strategies and lessons from past campaigns. I reached out to my network, letting them know I was consulting now. I joined webinars, commented on client companies' posts, attended virtual conferences. Slowly, I made myself visible, and then I waited. It didn't take long. 2 weeks later, I got my first call. It was Eleanor Price, VP of Marketing at Edgewell Industries, my biggest former client. "Jonathan, I just found out you're no longer with Stanton and Blake," she said, her voice tinged with annoyance. "Why didn't anyone tell me? We signed with that agency because of you, not them." I swallowed my satisfaction. "It was a business decision on their part," I said carefully. "Well, we're not happy. The team they've assigned now doesn't understand our brand." "Do you do independent consulting?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I do." And just like that, my first client followed me without me asking. Over the next month, it happened again and again. A VP from a healthcare company. A CMO from a tech firm. Quietly, without fanfare, they reached out. Some said outright that Stanton and Blake felt hollow without me. Others were simply curious about my services. I knew Mark was furious. One of my old colleagues, Mia, sent me a late-night text. "He's been screaming about you in meetings, losing clients left and right." It's chaos here, good, but I didn't gloat. Not yet. I focused on delivering results. I personally oversaw every campaign, every report, every creative brief. I worked 16-hour days, fueled by equal parts caffeine and vengeance. Rachel supported me fiercely, even as she adjusted to life with our newborn Sophie. There were nights when I doubted myself. Nights when the weight of responsibility to my family, my clients, myself, felt crushing. But every time I looked at Sophie sleeping in her crib, I remembered why I was doing this. Mark Stanton had taken my job. I was going to take his company. The first real tests came in month 2. Edgewell Industries, the client who'd called me first, wanted a full-scale rebranding campaign, the kind of work agencies usually staffed 10 people on. But I didn't have a team of 10. I had me, a freelance designer named Arjun, and a copywriter Lena, both working per project. It should have scared me. Instead, it thrilled me. I set up an intense but efficient workflow. Daily video calls with Arjun and Lena. Clear deliverables broken into manageable sprints. I personally oversaw every client meeting, ensuring Eleanor felt as if nothing had been lost in the transition. I didn't just want to match what Stanton and Blake could do. I wanted to prove that a small, focused team could deliver better, and we did. The campaign rolled out in 6 weeks, fully reimagining Edgewell's digital presence, new branding, tighter messaging, and an interactive social media strategy that doubled their engagement within the first month. Eleanor called me personally. "Jonathan, this is the best work I've seen in years. We should have just worked with you directly from the start." That call was fuel. By month 3, I had 5 clients, all former Stanton and Blake accounts. And I hadn't broken a single legal line. They had come to me willingly. My small agency, running out of a converted den, was pulling in $75,000 in monthly retainers. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was growth. But I wasn't satisfied. Mark's agency still had the majority of my old portfolio, and I knew exactly when those contracts were set to expire. That's when I decided to go on the offensive, strategically. I started by publishing thought leadership content, case studies of the work I'd done for Edgewell, without breaching confidentiality. I wrote articles about modern client-agency relationships, emphasizing responsiveness, transparency, and measurable ROI. In every post, I was making one clear point. The era of bloated, impersonal agencies was over. And people noticed. My LinkedIn engagement tripled. Former clients reached out just to check in. Other agency employees messaged me, quietly expressing admiration and disillusionment with their own employers. Behind the scenes, I began building a deeper bench. I brought Arjun and Lena on part-time retainers. I hired a project manager, Clara, whose organizational skills were unmatched. I even contracted a data analyst, Victor, for high-level campaign reporting. I wasn't just scaling for more work. I was preparing for a war. The war came to me in the form of an email, subject line, "Termination of services, Stanton and Blake." It was from Howard and Kingsley, a law firm client I'd managed for 5 years. They were cutting ties with Mark's agency and wanted to work with me instead. That night, Mia texted me again. "You should have seen Mark today. He threw his phone against the wall." Good. By month 4, 9 of my former clients had transitioned to Blake Strategies. The revenue gap left Stanton and Blake bleeding. I heard through the grapevine they'd lost a third of their staff. But the real moment of triumph came in month 5. Halcyon Group, a Fortune 500 company and the crown jewel of Stanton and Blake's portfolio, called me. "Jonathan," said David Krieger, their VP of marketing, "we've been unhappy since you left. Mark's team doesn't understand our needs. When your contract with him expired, we stayed out of loyalty. But loyalty only goes so far. Are you taking on new accounts?" I nearly dropped the phone. Halcyon was worth $4 million annually. "Yes," I said calmly, though my heart was pounding. "Let's talk." When Halcyon signed with me a month later, it was over. That single move caused a cascade. Smaller clients who had been waiting to see how I'd handle such a massive account followed. I didn't even need to call them. They called me. By month 6, Blake Strategies had grown into a $10 million agency with 11 staffers, all handpicked for their skills and work ethic. I moved out of my house office and into a sleek downtown space. Modest, but professional. And Stanton and Blake? Reports circulated that they were on the verge of bankruptcy. Mark had been forced to sell part of the company to cover debts. The man who once smirked at me across an HR table was now scrambling to keep his head above water. And me? I wasn't just surviving. I was winning. But I wasn't done yet. It was poetic that the final blow came almost exactly 6 months after I'd been fired. By then, Blake Strategies had become more than a fledgling agency. We were a force. Our client roster looked like a who's who of corporate heavyweights, and we had a reputation for responsiveness and results that Mark Stanton could never replicate with his bloated, decaying team. Still, I wanted closure. I wanted to face Mark on my own terms, not as a discarded employee begging for scraps, but as the man who had taken everything he'd tried to steal. The opportunity came in the form of an industry conference, the Midwest Marketing Leadership Summit, a high-profile event that gathered CMOs, CEOs, and agency heads. I'd been invited to speak on a panel about client-centric innovation. Ironically, the same panel Mark Stanton had been on for the past 5 years. This year, his name wasn't on the roster. When I walked onto that stage, I didn't feel nervous. I felt like I belonged. My talk wasn't flashy or vengeful. It was precise, deliberate, and rooted in what I'd learned building an agency from nothing. I spoke about agility, about listening to clients instead of treating them like billable hours, about cutting bureaucracy and focusing on measurable impact. Afterward, Eleanor from Edgewell approached me. "Jonathan, that was exactly what this industry needs. You've changed the game." But the real moment came in the networking hall. I was talking with David from Halcyon when I saw him, Mark Stanton. He looked smaller, not physically, but in presence. His once pristine suit was a touch wrinkled, his hair thinner at the temples. And that air of smugness? Gone. He saw me before I could decide whether to approach him. His jaw tightened, but he walked over. "Jonathan," he said, his voice stiff. "Mark," I replied evenly. "You've been busy," he said, scanning the crowd around me. I was surrounded by former clients of his, all of them laughing and engaged with me, as if I'd been their partner for decades. "Busy enough," I said. He gave a humorless chuckle. "You've made things difficult for us." "No, Mark," I said, meeting his gaze. "You made things difficult for yourself. You fired the person who built your book of business because you thought you could replace me. You were wrong." For a moment I saw it. A flicker of regret behind his eyes. "I didn't think you'd—" He started, then stopped himself. "Fight back?" I finished for him. "You underestimated me. You underestimated what integrity and trust mean in this industry. And now you're paying for it." He didn't reply. He just nodded stiffly and walked away, swallowed by the crowd. That was it. No screaming, no dramatic confrontation, just quiet defeat. A week later, I heard through Mia that Stanton and Blake had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. They were downsizing to a skeleton crew, desperately trying to salvage what little remained of their client base. Meanwhile, Blake Strategies signed 2 more major accounts, both from Stanton's old roster. On a Friday evening, after the Halcyon team signed their first renewal contract with us, I stood in my new downtown office, looking out at the Chicago skyline. Rachel walked in with Sophie in her arms. "You did it," she said softly. "No," I replied, taking my daughter into my arms. "We did it." And in that moment I realized it wasn't just about revenge. It was about proving to myself and everyone watching that you can't bury someone who refuses to stay down. I hadn't just survived Mark Stanton's betrayal. I'd turned it into the best thing that had ever happened to me. 6 months ago, I thought my life had ended in that sterile HR conference room. I thought losing my job at Stanton & Blake meant losing my security, my dignity, my future as a provider for my family. I remember the way my hands shook when I told Rachel I'd been fired. I remember feeling like the walls were closing in. The mortgage, the hospital bills, the weight of impending fatherhood. But standing here now, holding my daughter in one arm and reviewing the quarterly report for Blake Strategies in the other, I see it differently. That moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning. I learned that sometimes the worst betrayal can force you to find your truest strength. If Mark hadn't fired me, I would still be sitting in that glass-walled office, padding his ego and building his empire while neglecting my own potential. I would still be letting someone else decide my worth. Instead, I built something that reflects my values. An agency where clients aren't just line items, where employees aren't afraid to speak their minds, where innovation isn't a buzzword but a daily practice. We're small, agile, and personal, and that's our advantage. As for Mark Stanton, he became the cautionary tale of our industry. A man who underestimated the power of relationships, the importance of integrity, and the value of the very people who kept his company alive. He taught me, in the cruelest way possible, that when leaders treat people as disposable, they eventually destroy themselves. The greatest lesson I've learned through this journey? Competence and integrity are unstoppable when paired with resilience. You don't have to shout, threaten, or burn bridges to win. Sometimes you just have to stand your ground, work relentlessly, and let results speak for themselves. A few days ago, I got an email from a former Stanton & Blake employee, one of their best project managers. She wanted to join my team. She wrote, "I want to work somewhere that values people. I've heard that's what you're building." I smiled when I read it. Because that's the real victory. Not just taking clients, not just bankrupting a man who tried to bury me, but proving that there's a better way to do business. A way rooted in respect, trust, and vision. Sophie started fussing in Rachel's arms, pulling me back to reality. I closed the laptop, kissed my daughter's tiny forehead, and felt an overwhelming calm. Mark Stanton had taken my job, but in losing it, I gained everything that truly mattered, and I will never ever let anyone underestimate me again. Moral: respect the people who build your success, because without them, you have nothing. Never underestimate the quiet resilience of someone driven by integrity, purpose, and love. And when life takes everything from you, remember, it might just be clearing the way for you to build something better than you ever imagined.